there's a larger issue here. And this larger issue is the one that Paul Krugman half identified in an op-ed piece earlier this week, in which he talked about how the Republican Party, and I would add, when I say half, I would add, a large chunk of the Democratic Party as well. Not the entire Democratic Party by any stretch of the imagination. But, the third way Democrats, the DLC Democrats, the New Democrat Democrats, and the Republicans both proudly proclaim the fact that they have an allegiance not to what the people of the United States want, but to what the donor class wants. The whole third way DLC thing was put together back in the 90s as a way of, as the labor unions were dying off as a result of Reaganomics and the aggressive expansion of Taft-Hartley's so-called right to work for less. As this was happening in Republican, state after Republican state, they were all following the Reagan thing. As this was happening, the unions were dying out. Now, the unions were a traditional source of money for the Democratic machine, as it were, the institutional Democratic Party. And as that money started going away, some smart Democrats sat around and said, okay, the unions can't provide us with the money anymore. And this was before the era of online fundraising. Keep in mind, this was back in the 90s, back in the early 90s. And, some in the Democratic Party said, let's get in on the corporate gravy train. We will create, we will look at all of these issues and we'll figure out what are the ones where we can hold our nose and agree with big corporations who will then give us big bucks. And basically what the Democrats came up with was the banks and the entertainment industry and the high-tech industry. We will support them. And, in exchange for that, we'll take their donations, and then we don't need to depend on the labor unions quite so much. The Republicans said, hey, we'll go for the big money. We'll support the oil industry. We'll support the chemical industry. We'll support agribusiness. We'll support the big, dirty, insanely profitable, heavily subsidized industries. That's where we are. But neither party, and this is, we'll support the billionaires. So Krugman points out, he says, Mr. Bush has chosen to attack Mr. Trump as a false conservative, a proposition that's supposedly demonstrated by his deviations from current Republican economic orthodoxy, his willingness to raise taxes on the rich, his positive words about universal health care. Krugman says, Trump is right, Republicans are wrong. Well, it's not just that. But it's a great point. And his point is that the Republican Party, Republican politicians, do not care what Republican voters want. And by the way, it's anything goes summer here. If there's anything on your mind that you want to talk about, give us a shout. We'll be picking up your calls and all that sort of thing, in just a few minutes. But back to this show. So at what point do we call this out? At what point do we realize this? I mean, you could go through the list. It's really quite substantial of the areas where Americans are outside the parties. Okay? The Republican Party says, no, Medicare may not negotiate pharmaceutical prices, right? For Medicare, people who get Medicare have to pay the full retail price and Medicare has to reimburse them. Outside of the donut hole stuff. Republicans are taking that position, absolute line in the sand, and the Democrats are just saying, it's not a big deal for us. 79% of Americans want the government to be able to negotiate drug prices. 8 out of 10 Americans say, our government, since it's buying the drugs with our tax dollars, should be able to negotiate cheap prices from the drug companies, when they buy in volume. But the drug companies don't like that. And the drug companies are part of the DLC, coalition. Plus, they're deeply in bed with the Republican Party. 78% of Americans, this is from the poll of likely 2016 voters by the Progressive Change Institute, done by GBA Strategies. And this is a poll that I've quoted many times. It came out a couple of months ago. 78% of Americans think that students should be able to borrow money to go to college at the same rate that the big banks borrow money from the Fed. Less than 1%, or in the neighborhood of 1%. 78%. The Republicans won't go near that. They're wholly owned by the banks. And institutionally, the Democratic Party won't go near that because institutionally, the corporate Democratic Party, the DLC branch of the Debbie Wasserman Schultz part of the Democratic Party, is also in bed with the banks. 77% of Americans think we should have universal pre-K. In the Democratic Party, there's a battle going on between the high-tech billionaires who want to privatize education and people who want public education. And in the Republican Party, they all want to privatize education. So nobody wants universal pre-K. That's expanding the franchise. That's expanding free education. Oh, we can't have that. Either somebody's got to be able to make a buck off it, or we've got to, we can't do it. And this is just, these are, I mean, I've just started the list. This list goes on and on and on. And you can put all of this at the feet of the Supreme Court.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Because the reality is that in the United States, if politicians had to represent their constituents, the voters, we'd have a very different government.